The first $100,000 feels impossible not because of the number itself, but because of the way human psychology interacts with time, effort, and delayed reward, creating a stretch of financial progress where visible results lag far behind actual input, and where most people quietly disengage before the system has a chance to work. At the beginning of any financial journey, progress feels linear in effort but almost invisible in outcome, and this mismatch creates a subtle cognitive friction that is easy to underestimate, because the human brain is wired to expect feedback loops that confirm progress in real time. Yet money, especially in its early stages, does not behave that way. When someone starts from zero, every dollar saved or invested carries weight, but not impact. And that distinction is where most of the difficulty lies, because weight is effort-based while impact is system-based. And until a certain threshold is reached, the system remains too small to produce noticeable acceleration. This creates what can be understood as the silent phase of wealth building, where inputs are consistent but outputs remain relatively flat. And during this phase, discipline feels unrewarded, patience feels stretched, and the idea of compounding still exists more as a concept than a lived experience. Psychologically, this is where most people start negotiating with themselves, not in obvious ways, but in subtle justifications, where skipping a contribution once feels harmless, or increasing spending slightly feels deserved. And over time, these small deviations accumulate, not just financially, but behaviorally. The mind begins to reframe the process as inefficient, even when the system itself is working exactly as intended. And this misinterpretation is one of the core reasons why the first $100,000 feels disproportionately difficult compared to every milestone that follows. To understand why, it helps to shift from thinking about money as static accumulation and instead view it as a dynamic system governed by multiplication over time, where early stages are dominated by contribution and later stages are dominated by growth. In the beginning, nearly all financial progress comes from active input, meaning earned income, saved income, and intentional allocation. And because the base number is small, any percentage-based growth applied to it produces results that are mathematically correct but emotionally underwhelming. For example, a 7% return on $1,000 produces $70, which is technically growth, but not transformative in any meaningful sense. And because the human brain tends to evaluate outcomes in absolute terms rather than percentage terms, this kind of growth feels insignificant. Now compare that to a 7% return on $100,000, which produces $7,000, and suddenly the same system that once felt slow begins to feel powerful, even though nothing about the underlying mechanics has changed. This is the core mathematical shift that defines the journey to the first $100,000. Where the system transitions from being contribution-driven to growth-assisted and eventually to growth-dominant. But reaching that transition point requires enduring a long stretch where effort is high and visible reward is low. And this is where behavioral economics becomes more relevant than pure mathematics. Humans are not naturally inclined to persist through delayed gratification without feedback, especially when surrounded by alternative options that provide immediate satisfaction. And in modern economic environments, those alternatives are everywhere, from small daily conveniences to larger lifestyle upgrades that feel justified in the moment. Each of these choices, on their own, appears minor, but collectively they shape the trajectory of financial progress by either reinforcing or weakening the consistency required to reach that first major threshold. There is also a social layer to this difficulty, where financial behavior is influenced not just by internal discipline, but by external comparison. And when progress is not visibly apparent, it becomes harder to maintain conviction in a path that does not yet show results. This is particularly important because early wealth building is largely invisible, meaning that two individuals could be making very different financial decisions while appearing to live similar lifestyles, and this lack of visible differentiation can distort perception. Someone who is consistently allocating resources toward long-term growth may not appear any different from someone who is not, at least in the early stages. And without visible reinforcement, the motivation to continue becomes internally dependent rather than externally supported. This is where identity begins to play a critical role, because the process of reaching the first $100,000 is less about financial optimization and more about behavioral alignment. where actions are guided by a long-term framework rather than short-term emotional feedback. From a mathematical perspective, the journey can be broken into phases, where the early phase is dominated by accumulation through saving. The middle phase introduces the initial effects of compounding, and the later phase sees compounding begin to meaningfully contribute to total growth. In the first phase, progress is almost entirely dependent on income minus expenses, which means that improvements come from either increasing earnings, reducing spending, or both. And while this seems straightforward, it requires consistent decision-making over extended periods of time. In the second phase, once a base has been established, returns begin to add a secondary layer of growth. But at this stage, they are still relatively small compared to contributions, which means that the primary driver remains behavioral consistency. It is only in the later phase, approaching and surpassing the $100,000 mark, that compounding starts to produce outputs that are large enough to be noticed without close inspection, and this is where the experience of wealth building begins to feel different. The difficulty is that most people evaluate the process too early, during a phase where the system has not yet had time to demonstrate its full effect, and as a result, they draw conclusions based on incomplete data. This would be similar to evaluating a long-term investment after only a short period and assuming that the initial trend will define the entire trajectory, when in reality, the most significant changes occur later in the timeline. Another factor that contributes to the perceived difficulty is the way fixed costs interact with lower income levels, creating a situation where a larger percentage of earnings is required just to maintain baseline living conditions, leaving less room for allocation toward growth. This is part of the reason why the first $100,000 is not just a financial milestone, but a structural one, because reaching it often requires developing systems that operate efficiently within constraints, which then continue to function as income grows. In other words, the behaviors required to reach that first threshold are the same behaviors that enable further growth, but once the system reaches a certain scale, the outcomes begin to accelerate. There is also an asymmetry in how losses and gains are perceived during this phase, where small setbacks feel disproportionately significant compared to small gains, due to a psychological bias that places more weight on losses than equivalent gains. This can create a feedback loop where temporary declines or missed opportunities feel discouraging enough to disrupt consistency, even when the overall trajectory remains intact. Understanding this dynamic is important because it reframes the challenge from being about hitting a specific number to maintaining a specific pattern of behavior long enough for the system to reach a scale where it begins to support itself. The number $100,000 is not inherently special in isolation, but it represents a point where percentage-based growth starts to produce results that are large enough to reinforce the process, making it easier to continue. Before that point, the process relies heavily on discipline without reinforcement, and after that point, it begins to benefit from reinforcement without additional effort, which is why the experience changes so noticeably. This transition can be thought of as moving from pushing a system forward to allowing the system to begin pulling itself forward, where the role of active input gradually decreases relative to the contribution of accumulated capital. From a systems perspective, this is where momentum becomes a factor, not in a physical sense, but in a financial one, where the existing base amplifies future outcomes without requiring proportional increases in effort. But reaching this stage requires enduring a period where progress feels slow, inconsistent, and at times uncertain, even though the underlying mechanics are stable and predictable. This is why the first $100,000 often feels impossible, not because it defies mathematical logic, but because it challenges psychological endurance, requiring individuals to operate in alignment with a system that does not immediately validate their efforts. The shift that makes this milestone attainable is not a sudden increase in income or a single breakthrough moment, but a gradual alignment between behavior, expectation, and understanding, where the process is no longer judged by short. When this shift occurs, the journey becomes less about reaching a specific number and more about maintaining a structure that allows numbers to grow naturally over time. And in that sense, the first $100,000 is less a destination and more a transformation in how financial progress is experienced. Once that transformation takes place, the same system that once felt slow begins to feel responsive, and the same actions that once required effort begin to feel automatic. Not because the external environment has changed, but because the internal framework has adjusted to match the nature of the system itself. And that is why the first $100,000 feels impossible at the beginning, but inevitable in retrospect, because the difficulty was never in the number, it was in sustaining the process long enough for the system to reveal how it actually works. And this is where an even deeper layer begins to reveal itself. Because the difficulty of the first $100,000 is not just about slow compounding or limited capital. It is also about how modern economic systems are structured to absorb small amounts of surplus before they can accumulate into something meaningful. At lower income and asset levels, most financial activity exists in what could be called a high-friction environment, where money is constantly being redirected toward necessities, obligations, and short-term consumption, leaving very little room for sustained accumulation, and this creates a structural pressure that reinforces the feeling of stagnation. It is not just that progress is slow. It is that the system continuously introduces small drains that prevent momentum from forming. Things like transaction costs, debt interest, reactive spending, and even time constraints all function as subtle forms of resistance, each one individually manageable, but collectively significant enough to keep capital from compounding efficiently. And this is where the experience becomes psychologically confusing. Because from the outside, it appears as if the problem is discipline or strategy, but from the inside, it often feels like running against a current that never fully stops. You move forward, but the environment quietly pulls back. This dynamic is not accidental. Historically, if you look at different economic periods, whether during early industrial expansion or more recent consumer-driven economies, there has always been a distinction between those operating within high-friction financial conditions and those who have moved into lower-friction environments where capital can accumulate more freely. The difference is not always effort. It is positioning. In a high-friction state, most financial decisions are reactive. You respond to expenses, you adjust to circumstances, and your time is closely tied to maintaining stability. But as capital increases, even gradually, that environment begins to change. Friction does not disappear, but it becomes relatively smaller compared to the total system you are operating within. A fixed cost becomes a smaller percentage. An unexpected expense becomes less disruptive. Time becomes less constrained by immediate financial pressure. And these shifts, while subtle, begin to compound in ways that are not immediately obvious. This is why the first $100,000 is often described as a turning point, not because it guarantees anything, but because it represents a level where the balance between friction and momentum starts to shift. Below that point, friction dominates. Above it, momentum begins to have a measurable effect. And once momentum exists, even in small amounts, the system starts to behave differently. But there is another layer that makes this threshold feel even more distant, and it relates to how humans perceive large numbers relative to their current reality. When someone is earning or saving in the range of a few hundred or a few $1,000s at a time, the idea of $100,000 exists outside their normal reference frame, which means the brain does not process it as a sequence of achievable steps, but as a single, overwhelming target. This is a cognitive distortion. Because mathematically, $100,000 is nothing more than the sum of smaller consistent actions over time, but psychologically, it is treated as a different category altogether. And when a goal feels disconnected from present reality, motivation becomes inconsistent. People either overestimate what they can do in the short term or underestimate what they can sustain over the long term, and both patterns lead to the same outcome: interruption. Short bursts of effort followed by resets. And every reset carries a hidden cost, not just in lost time, but in lost compounding cycles. Because compounding does not only apply to money, it applies to behavior. Consistency builds momentum in the same way that capital does, and when that consistency is broken, the system does not just pause, it partially resets. This is why two individuals with similar incomes can end up in very different positions over time. One maintains steady, moderate contributions with minimal interruption, while the other cycles between periods of high effort and complete disengagement. From a distance, their efforts may appear similar, but mathematically, the outcomes diverge. Because the system rewards continuity more than intensity. And this is one of the least intuitive aspects of financial growth. It is not optimized for bursts. It is optimized for duration. At the same time, there is an identity component that quietly influences behavior throughout this phase. Before reaching a certain level of capital, many people unconsciously see themselves as participants in the economy rather than as accumulators of capital within it. This distinction is subtle, but it shapes decision-making. If your identity is tied to earning and spending, then saving feels like a temporary action, something you do when conditions allow. But if your identity shifts toward building and maintaining capital, then saving becomes structural. It becomes part of how the system operates, not an exception to it. And identity shifts rarely happen because of a number alone. They happen because of repeated exposure to a different pattern of behavior, which means that the process of reaching the first $100,000 is not just building capital. It is building the identity required to sustain that capital once it exists. Without that identity shift, even if the number is reached, it can be unstable. Money can flow in and out without establishing a lasting base. This is why some people experience progress but struggle to maintain it. The system was built externally, but not internally. And without internal alignment, external systems tend to break under pressure. There is also a time dimension that becomes clearer when you step back and observe this process from a wider perspective. If you map out the accumulation of capital over time, the early stages often look almost flat, a slow incline that barely separates itself from zero. But this visual can be misleading, because what appears flat is actually the most structurally important phase. It is where habits are formed, where systems are tested, and where resilience is built. Later stages may show more visible growth, but they rely entirely on what was established earlier. This creates a paradox. The phase that feels least rewarding is often the most consequential. And because it feels unrewarding, it is the phase most people abandon, which is why the first $100,000 remains a barrier for so many. Not because it is mathematically unreachable, but because it requires persistence through a period where the system provides minimal emotional reinforcement. And this brings us back to the core idea. The first $100,000 feels impossible not because of the number itself, but because of the environment, the psychology, and the structure surrounding it. It exists at the intersection of low capital, high friction, delayed feedback, and unstable identity. Remove any one of these factors, and the process becomes easier to sustain. But when they all exist at once, the experience feels disproportionately difficult. Yet, within that difficulty, there is also a kind of proof. Because once you move through this phase, once capital reaches a level where momentum begins to assist rather than resist, the system starts to reveal its other side. Growth becomes more visible. Decisions carry more leverage. Time begins to compound not just effort, but outcomes. And perhaps most importantly, the gap between what is happening and what you can perceive begins to close. At that point, the number itself loses its psychological weight. It is no longer a distant concept. It is part of your lived experience. And when something becomes part of your lived experience, it no longer feels impossible. It feels repeatable, which is a very different kind of power. Not the power of reaching a single milestone, but the power of understanding the system that made it possible in the first place. Because once you understand that system, the question is no longer how to reach $100,000. It becomes how to continue operating within a structure that naturally builds on itself over time. And that is where the real shift happens, not at the number, but in the way you see the path that leads beyond.